Quite good. So identification, where's my remote? Of the research and capacity building issues for mainstreaming sustainable farming practices is a culmination of the ideas that emerged during discussions with farmers, discussions with the project steering committee, and the reflection of the project's technical team on the farming experience. So much of what we discuss here is what came out of this 2-year project. But of course, the technical team have been working with farmers for a number of years, so they bring their own experiences into the mix. And what we try to do is cover a lot of these issues in this. So, in terms of what the objective of this exercise set out to do, what we wanted to do is to pull out some of these issues that can assist farming communities and stakeholders in addressing some of the key issues in implementing sustainable farming practices. So, the issues outlined, as I said before, are based primarily on the experience of the eco-agriculture project. As such, the focus of the project is on sustainable farming practices at the small scale, so less than 10 hectare size farm, and at the community level, but recognizing that with all things, we must frame it in a larger national and regional agricultural context, as these unavoidably affect the small farmer. So what exactly do we mean by these sustainable farming practices? So we've, throughout the project, understood sustainable farming practices as those practices which lend to economic sustainability. So we've worked with farmers not only to focus on the long-term benefits of these sustainable farming practices, and in fact what the farmers asked us for were, what are the short-term benefits, because these are the things that are important to us. We're eking out our livelihood here. How is mulching helping me in the short term? Environmental sustainability. Practices should reflect an awareness of the impact on the surrounding environment, and of course promoting the idea of responsibility within the environment. And then, of course, there's livelihood sustainability. And we recognize that livelihood opportunities must be economically and socially attractive to keep persons involved in agriculture. So I think we understand quite well the economically attractive part, but socially attractive. What do we need to do to raise the profile of agriculture in the country so that we have more persons wanting to take on farming as a career, Right, so in terms of farming practices, and let me just step back to say how we frame this entire exercise is to look at 3 components. So farming practices, sharing and networking among farmers and different actors, and then looking at policy. So what we found in terms of farming practices was a strong desire among farmers to better understand the economic impacts of the practices that are being promoted. Of course, this is something that they ask, and every interaction, every group interaction that we've had with farmers, this is what has emerged as the leading question. We understand, too, from our interaction that farmers, as was highlighted several times this morning, do appreciate the benefits of these sustainable farming practices. And again, that farmers are concerned about the short-term cost with transitioning to more sustainable farming practices. So jumping quickly to what are the needs based on some of these issues that were flagged. Evidence-based case studies are a need for moving forward in terms of adopting sustainable farming practices on a large scale. And evidence-based case studies don't necessarily need to come out of rigorous projects that have large amounts of funding, but really what they are a reflection, just like how Dr. Dolly shared that farmers mince up batchak and do this, that, and the other to deal with farming. That in itself is a case study. We had a contribution from Shango this morning talking about how he planted on the nest. That is a case study in itself in helping to deal with the batchaks. So we're looking at different formulations for developing these case studies. And most importantly, the case studies should describe benefits that are relevant to farmers. So for example, at the last stakeholder workshop in May, there was a guy here from Earl Narona from Wasamaki Agriculture. He pointed out, and he gave a bit of a history in his transition to more organic farming, citing that what he did was not, he didn't attempt to just do everything all at once, because he did that and he lost out tremendously. This is an important lesson that farmers at that workshop were surprised to hear. Instead, what he did was to transition piece by piece every year, so at 10% of his farm every year, setting aside one portion and then expanding that portion as he went. And this is the kind of information that is important, and this is the kind of information that we need to get out. So highlighting the successes and challenges and how these were overcome should be featured in these case studies. We found two very good examples in our work. Kudus Mohammed, who farms in the Kora Valley, does wonderful things in terms of sustainable farming practices. Very little, very, very little use of inorganic inputs. And then we had Bruce Herbert, whose farm I actually went to visit. When he told me his story, my mouth dropped open. For 20 years, for more than 20 years, he has been working this land and has managed to do extensive bench terracing. Folks, if I tell you how steep this land is, you would not believe me. I'm standing right here and looking up at the land right there. And he has bench terraced it and shown how even farming on such land could be sustainable through adopting certain types of practices. Projects for engaging farmers in on-farm research. So we spoke about this morning through approaches like the Farmer Field School, where organizations work directly with farmers. So we start to understand how we deal with issues in the context of other issues that affect the farmer. So we're not talking about model farms here, where conditions are almost perfect. No, we're talking about real conditions. Whitefly affecting you, how you dealt with it. Your neighbor using a whole set of inorganic inputs to deal with his whitefly, while you're not using any. So the whitefly coming across to you. So how do you deal with that? And that's the sort of information that we need to understand as well. So we get a richer picture of how we deal with some of these very complex issues. One of the things that we've been trying to engage farmers in is using a portion of their land to better understand how practices relate to farm production cost. So we're moving beyond this idea of the environmental benefits and things like that, because really what speaks to people are the economic benefits. How are my production costs being addressed by these sustainable farming practices? And what we want to do is engage in some sort of project or partnership that allows a farmer to do this in a low-risk type environment. Requisite for what I've spoken about before, these projects and types of partnerships, is continuous technical support for farmers. So we already have institutions set up to provide this technical support, the extension services of the ministry, etc. But what we found in our interactions with farmers is that these need to be strengthened and these need to be supported, particularly by the other research institutions that exist to serve agriculture, things like institutions like CARDI, for example, the university. How is the university linking with the extension services in order to provide services for the farmer? This is a point that's very dear to my heart, this issue of continuous technical support. Because when I started in the foundation, one of the buzz terms, and it still continues to be a buzz term, is capacity building. And in fact, it is a buzz term in development, but I think we haven't gotten it right. Because overwhelmingly, the evidence shows that development occurs, development projects occurs, and capacity is not built. Something is going wrong in our approach to development. And I feel, among other things, what is going wrong, and Canary highlighted this in a review of their experiences in the different islands, that time is the issue that we need to deal with. Long-term partnerships, and if you want to call them projects, long-term projects and partnerships are the things that we need. So for example, the eco-agriculture project did well for building up the partnership with the farmer, for building those relationships. Then we want to think about another project that continues to, for example, implement the sustainable farming practices and does some monitoring and evaluation. And then on another track, work towards influencing policy. And these projects together formulate some sort of program. So this is the kind of thinking that we need. There are opportunities, therefore, for public-private partnerships. For example, what has gone on between the Cropper Foundation and many other institutions. Key is, of course, the extension services of the ministry, because they are the ones who interact most directly with the farmers. And I think what could work very well, and is an issue, an area that we need to explore, what are the correct frameworks for having private sector here providing technical and resource support. Then you have the extension services as the knowledge transfer, information transfer agents who can transform a lot of that technical and resource support into something that is usable for the farmers. And I spoke to before the opportunities for engaging in research that is done in the context of real world and daily issues. Livelihood sustainability needs to consider the changing variables that affect agriculture. So we touched on climate change this morning, and this is a serious issue. And I think the time is ripe, and the funding opportunities are ripe to engage farmers in projects that look at how they can be more resilient and how they can adapt their farming systems to the expected climate changes. So things like more intense rainfall, for more intense droughts, for drier periods, looking at what crops are in fact suitable to these new conditions. And then, by extension, what crops, therefore, do help us to achieve the conservation objectives. So there's a lot that could be done, and I think we just need to put on our thinking caps and look at the ability of partnerships, the opportunities for funding, and create some work out of that. All right, so in terms of sharing and networking among actors, what we did was to look at the various actors that had been involved in this project and place them into three categories. So we had knowledge generators, those are the ones who do research. So farmers are knowledge generators through their observation and trial and error and things like that. We have institutions like CARDI, FAO, UE, Ministry of Food Production, Research Department, NGOs like CROP, and various other civil society organizations and researchers, of course. Then we have the knowledge transfer agents, who are the sort of middlemen who take this information from these research institutions and researchers and transform it and pass it on to farmers. So farmers themselves are knowledge transfer agents through sharing information. Extension services of the ministry, NGOs and CBOs, civil society again, and crucial are the farmers' organizations as well as important locally based knowledge transfer agents. Then we have the knowledge applicators, those ones who use the knowledge, and we've identified here the farmers and the extension officers. So this is the way we framed and we thought about sharing and networking. Successful and long-term adoption of sustainable farming practices requires the effective communication and sharing among these actors. And that is something we know. Sharing experiences on the adoption of sustainable farming practices is an effective way of promoting the use of these practices. So what we found was that relationships tend to be strong among farmers. I think this is something that we could appreciate. Farmer-to-farmer interaction represents a major form of information transfer. How you do with our bachak, boy? Yeah, I mix up a batch of garlic, some hot pepper, this, that, and the other, and I put it on the farm. Very important for sharing information, is this direct transfer. And why? We found that information sharing is more effective when farmers speak directly to each other, because, of course, they know the things that they want to ask, and they know the information they want. And one of the things that I've always found with farmers is that they're very blunt. They're interested in this, they'll ask about this, and they'll get the information and move on. I like that kind of approach. And that is something that we need to take on board when we think about communication, etc., of project findings, that sort of thing. We found that the relationships between the farmer and the extension workers vary and really depends on how the relationship is contextualized. For example, some farmers saw the extension worker as a bringer or supplier of inputs to substitute for other things, right? So where you have for me to deal with white fly, where you can get me for that, blah, blah, blah. Whereas there are other farmers who engaged the extension workers in a deeper discussion about similar issues, but looking at how you look at issues like pest management and things like that in a wider context that has to deal with suppression of pests and understanding that they are natural in the environment as opposed to trying to totally eradicate. So the contextualization is important, And we found also from our interactions with particularly research institutions that the transfer of knowledge from research institution to farmer is limited in most respects. So what are the needs? We spoke to this before, demonstration of the farming method in practice in the context of other real-world issues, being a powerful tool for promoting these sustainable farming practices. Now, ICA, they do this to some extent. They actually take farmers from Trinidad to other islands to demonstrate how farmers in other places are doing things. And we attempted to do this as well with the Eco-Agriculture Project, to take farmers from Maracas, take them to Cora, show them how things done there, and back and forth, of course. And within other areas of Trinidad and Tobago, of course, there are wonderful demonstration farms that we can visit. How can this be done? Now, let me tell you, as project manager for this project, simply trying to organize that visit to farmers, to different farms, it was a task. Because people, it's a mix of varying sort of schedules during the day, farmers doing this thing, they market here and there. So really trying to get farmers organized to move across to different places was particularly difficult for me as a person outside of the valley. So what I think has great potential, and this I often discuss with the technical team and with the farmers' organizations, are that farmers' networks themselves have great potential for doing this sort of thing. Of course, this requires funding and other resource support and that sort of thing. And this is where the partnerships can be formed between, for example, the farmers' organizations or networks and the funding agencies. So the farmers' organizations lead this sort of process as opposed to an external agent leading this sort of process. And when we talk about building capacity, that is building capacity there, giving them that power to do that sort of thing. Of course, anyone who knows anything about farmer networks and farmer organizations are well aware of the different issues, or the myriad of issues that these organizations face. And in fact, many are characterized as being largely unsuccessful. So what we need, and I'm glad we have a social scientist here, we need to delve in more into what are the social and governance issues that cause the breakdown of farmer networks and are the requisites for the success of the farmer networks. And these are things that we need to, as much as we engage in research on farming practices, that sort of thing, when we talk about building capacity and sustainability of the initiative, these are areas that definitely need to be touched on. We spoke about the link between extension services, the importance of extension services, as being the link between research institutions and farmers. In practice, this linkage is very weak, and therefore there are opportunities for investigations into different frameworks. And I know that there are a number of extension frameworks that have been used in several other countries for linking research, extension, and farmers. So a lot of issues here that are researchable that we can take on. A first exercise in doing this, in uncovering this strength or weakness of linkages between actors is, of course, mapping the linkages between the actors. And I think this, in going forward, is one of the things that we need to focus on when we start thinking about capacity building, so we know exactly what we need to address. All right, so quickly moving on to policy. Now, when I attempted in speaking about policy to different people, to my farmers and research institutions or whatever, a lot of raised eyebrows, shrugs, all that sort of thing. No, don't delve up in policy, etc., etc. But I think we understand, we don't have a very good understanding of what policy is, and we tend to think a lot about national level policy and this kind of macro policy. But really, if we understand policy to be a process of developing collective action, there's content, there are certain rules and regulations for the way we behave, and then of course there's practice. All of these things comprise policy, and therefore when we look at the local level, there are opportunities for developing local agricultural policies, and these would simply be a modus of operating with regards to agriculture in specific areas. Of course, your local agricultural policy must be nested within the national agricultural policy, as this affects the local policy. And it should be farmer-led and reflect the goals and aspirations of the farming community. The formulations of the policy must be flexible, so we can't be too rigid with what we say 50% use of inorganic fertilizers mandated throughout the valley when people have different circumstances. So we need to be flexible with these sorts of things. Policy regulation and enforcement is, of course, a key concern, and who's going to do it? And I think, and this is something that I want to discuss, one of the best set of actors for doing this sort of thing are your farmers' organizations. They are already established, and what we need to do, again, is to investigate what is the capacity needed to enable these organizations to be able to, first of all, undertake that whole policy development process, so understanding what are the various practices and pooling them together, and in a participatory way, trying to come up with a set of practices that kind of define that valley. So when we go into the Cora Valley, we know that all of the crops grown here are done in an eco-friendly way, and that's the policy of the valley. So we ensure that when we go and we purchase crops from that area, that they are grown in a particular way, and that's the kind of thing we need to start moving towards. And I know that Terence and his group have already started moving towards that, and we'll speak more about that this afternoon. So, of course, we can't leave out the important questions that relate to national agricultural policy in support of the long-term adoption and mainstreaming of sustainable farming practices. There are a list of questions, for example, where are sustainable farming practices on the political priority agenda of the government? Are we hearing them talk about it? Are there incentives specifically for sustainable farming practices? We heard about some this morning. Are farmers able to, in fact, access these incentives? How do we raise the profile of sustainable farming practices in the government? Is it that we need to link it to a health issue? Do we need to link it to larger economic type issues, looking at agriculture being this sort of cross-cutter across all sectors and being a very important economic a source of economic revenue and livelihood and sustainability, that sort of thing? How do we scale up from these kind of project-by-project basis projects and impacts into more national scale type things? What sort of programs do we need to develop? Folks, a lot of questions I'm throwing out here. How can government incentivize farmers to adopt farming practices? We spoke about that already. Consumer information related to health issues, etc. So, in summary, we find that significant effort needs to be placed on strengthening the institutional framework supporting agriculture. And at the higher levels, and this is the relationships between the research institutions, etc., greater communication and cooperation is needed. It is a key challenge and has continued to be a key challenge. So we look to people like Greg to help us understand how places like ICA and FAO, etc., are working towards helping to resolve those issues so that they become better providers of services for farmers. We need to strengthen and implement the mechanisms that help to ensure good governance within our community organizations, things like accountability, transparency, inclusiveness, that sort of thing. And we acknowledge that the responsibility for the adoption and implementation of these sustainable farming practices ultimately rests with the farmer. But we do recognize the need for a strong and long-term system of technical and resource support to build up the farmers' capacity and to continue encouraging and incentivizing farmers. And this, of course, needs to be couched in a long-term strategic goal for agriculture.